Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine the 10th of July of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the United States of America, about Washington, where we can see lots of leaders from every single European country, from almost every single European country, from every single country that is the member of this NATO organization. We have lots of talks, lots of conversations, lots of meetings, lots of statements. One of the most important statements, for example, we received from the Jens Stoltenberg, already former General Secretary of NATO. He stated that the biggest risk and the biggest cause for NATO today is the risk of Russia victory in Ukraine. We cannot allow this. That was official statement of this person. Furthermore, we got more, let's say, statements from his side. Also, he reported that that is too early to talk about the timing of Ukraine's entry into the alliance. So this is a complete lie, and we will discuss this in a moment. We have also reports from the Polish authorities. They stated that Ukraine will not join NATO until the end of the special military operation. That was stated by the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda. As for Zelensky himself, he also reported and talked a lot, and tomorrow, for example, he has a meeting with the president of the United States of America, Joe Biden, where probably Joe Biden will announce additional military package or additional package with some weapon. But today, as for the 10th of July, the most important topic, of course, is F-16. For example, today the Secretary of State of the United States of America, Antony Blinken, stated that, according to information he has, those F-16 jets will be flying in the skies of Ukraine this summer. And the sources reported that there are already F-16s in Europe that are heading in direction of Ukraine. Zelensky commented the situation. If you remember, a few weeks ago, he was talking that Ukraine needs 10 or 20 or 30, maybe 40 F-16s that can change the situation on the ground in the sky of Ukraine. And today he reported that Ukraine needs at least 128 F-16 fighters. Very weird and very interesting number. Why 128? Why not 150? Why not 300? Why not 1000? Why exactly 128? Probably Zelensky is the only person who knows why exactly. He stated that Russian Federation uses 300 aircrafts against Ukraine every day. We had a decision on 10 and 20 F-16s. Even if there are 50, it's nothing. They need 128. And according to information we have, right before I start making the video, some Russian sources published the video, the map of that controls and collect the data of the flights and the jets in above the territory of Europe. And according to information we have, 6 F-16s were spotted in Dutch and Belgian airspace, Netherlands F-16s. So something is flying above Europe, something is flying towards Ukraine. Of course, this is going to be a part of the special operation. The Western countries, NATO countries, will try to do everything they can, but not to allow the Russians to discover the real airfields of these F-16s and not to destroy them. But of course, it's just a game, it's just a political games. The most important report that we got today is that Poland is going to create a possible zone of no-fly zone. This is very important because, of course, some people reported that Patriot, the range of Patriot is limited. They can't attack for 3, 4, 500 kilometers. But telling the truth, NATO counters Ukraine and Patriots, they don't need to be able to attack the aircrafts within a distance of 400-500 kilometers or something like this. 25-30 kilometers is enough. But and you need to understand one important thing, that this no-fly zone is something more than just no-fly zone. I'll try to explain to you the exact and the real plans of the NATO countries and Ukraine itself with these Patriots and this no-fly zone. Now let's return back to map and let's try to discuss what is the possible range of work of these F-16s. And if we add some lines, we can calculate that this is approximately the area that F-16s will cover. So a very short territory, a very short line along the border. So at the beginning of the creation of possible no-fly zone in Ukraine during the next few months, possibly, the NATO countries and Western countries, United States of America, Poland, island itself, Ukraine will be able to protect and to take under control just a small territory along the border. So exactly this is the territory that is going to be covered and protected by possible number of Patriot systems that will be delivered on to Ukraine during the next few months. From this perspective, we understand that this is nothing. This is nothing, but I must tell you that we need to understand one important thing. If you remember, when the Russians just started the Kharkiv buffer zone operation, some pro-Russian sources, some pro-Russian people, or those who support Russia for 100%, when there were wishful thinking, of course, they expected, almost everybody, 90% of people were expecting that when the Russians begin, if the Russians begin their buffer zone operation, of course, they will be stopped somewhere along Dnipro River. But when the operation started, we see completely different reality, and we see that the buffer zone, that the Russians were stopped on the line between Глубоко, Лукьянцы, Staritsa, Bugruvatka, Vovchansk, very unimportant, let's say not completely not important towns and villages. And obviously from these points of view we understand that this is not very probably good or successful buffer zone operation or something like this. But the thing is that this is not the correct way of thinking. First of all, we need to understand, yes, that the Russians started their buffer zone operation. The Ukrainians discovered this operation. Of course, the Ukrainians would do everything they can, would do everything they can, but not to allow the Russians to improve their positions. So that's why, according to the information we discussed in the previous updates, they managed to concentrate significant number of forces, and now the Ukrainians are trying to slow down the Russians. So obviously, as soon as the Russians are able to destroy the group of forces, Ukrainian group of forces that are located in Kharkiv area, what the Russians are going to do next? Yes, you're completely correct. The Russians will continue moving further in direction of Kharkiv. Then they will face another group of Ukrainian forces, and they will spend another half a year to destroy another group of Ukrainian forces. And as soon as they do this, the Russians will continue moving further, and this is going like a chain process, step by step, one army by one, another army, one Ukrainian group of forces by another, and probably this will be finished maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years if no negotiation starts, maybe somewhere along Dnipro River. So this is the Russian buffer zone Kharkiv operation, and this is Russian buffer operation. So tell me please, what is the difference between Russian buffer zone operation and, let's say, NATO, let's call it the same way, NATO buffer zone operation, because this territory along the border is not like no-fly zone. This is the buffer zone. This is the zone that is going to be 100% sure that the Russians will not be able to enter this territory, never, not just but with missiles, aircrafts, but also with soldiers, tanks, and many other different types of weapons. Because this territory will be completely protected by Patriot systems, by F-16s, NATO F-16s, and of course, if you don't have superiority in the skies, there is no chances to and no need, and it's going to be not very smart to attack this territory on the ground. So tell me please, as soon as the NATO countries are able to establish this buffer zone, what can stop them to improve this, let's say, buffer zone for another 25 kilometers, so they can move their Patriot systems a bit further in the eastern direction and to secure another territory, another 25 kilometers. And for example, as a result of the second wave of, let's say, creation of no-fly zone, in this case, the NATO countries will be able to cover with air defense towns like Kovil, town like city like Lvov, and many other different towns in the settlement in the western part of Ukraine. And after the NATO countries are able to secure additional 25 kilometers to the east, tell me please, what can stop them to move for another 25 kilometers during, let's say, the next 3 or 4 months? Telling the truth, nothing will be able to stop NATO countries to move the same way as the Russians, so to move the same kilometers to the east as the Russians are moving from to the west. Nothing can stop, and basically, I'm telling the truth, this is not no-fly zone operation that NATO countries are going to conduct. This is the process of splitting of Ukraine. splitting of Ukraine into at least three parts. First part is the territory that is under Russian control. The second part is the no-fly zone by NATO countries. And fourth part is the central part of Ukraine, let's say Kiev, maybe everything along Dnipro River. Because we need to understand that if NATO countries are able to reach this line, I have some doubts that the Russians will be able to force NATO countries to fall back. You know that a few days ago the United States officials reported that Ukraine will win this war, but most likely Ukrainians will not be able to force the Russians to abandon their positions in Lugansk, DPR, or Kharkiv or Zaporozhye. We can tell the same thing. Most likely Russia will win this war in Ukraine, but most likely the Russians will not be able to force NATO countries to abandon positions of their no-fly zone. So the same logic, the same, let's say, sentences, but completely different titles of the countries, but the process is the same. And the process, as you can see, has already started. Ukraine currently is being divided by NATO and Russia in at least three parts. Probably three parts will be reduced to two parts, but it's just a matter of time, of course. Now let's move to the situation on the ground. As for the NATO buffer zone, of course, everything is okay. Ukrainians in the western part of Ukraine are very happy to see NATO countries F-16 Patriot systems. So the process in this area is very democratic and very, very peaceful. As for another buffer zone in the eastern part of Ukraine, everything is not so smooth. There are very heavy clashes, lots of casualties among first of all Ukrainians and less from the Russian side, but anyway, there are very heavy clashes. Let's talk about Gluboko area. The Ukrainians continued their offensive, and the Russians stated that for the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, not since the beginning of the battle for Kharkiv, they started using the drone swarm tactics. So significant number of drones were flying above this territory, mainly above the territory of main Russian supply roads, and even the Ukrainians were attacking standalone soldiers, not even a group of forces, not even like a tanks, but standalone soldiers were also under very heavy fire and attacks of FPV drones of armored forces of Ukraine. So that caused significant damage to logistics, first of all, and caused significant problems for the Russians that are currently located, that are currently blocked in the village of Gluboko. The Russians need to change something if they don't want to have problems, first of all, with the garrison inside of this village. Now let's move to Volchansk. As you can see, we have a lot of very interesting geolocations. First of all, the most interesting thing that there are a lot of geolocations. After a very long probably operational pause or some unpredictable or some situation that we can't explain in the northern part, southern part, we see that the Russians intensified their activity. The battle for Volchansk was very long. The battle for Volchansk was very difficult for both sides, either for the Russians and for Ukrainians. Just for 1 month, either the Russians and the Ukrainians were trying to test each other in different direction. First, there was a clashes. There were very heavy clashes for the citadel, but the Russians managed to reduce to ruins the first line, but still they can't move further deep inside of the citadel. There were a lot of reports about the situation in aggregate plant, about that the Russians were encircled, that the Russians weren't encircled, that the Russians had a supply roads, that the Ukrainians established complete control over the supply roads. Then there were lots of talks about the situation in the eastern part when the Ukrainians were trying to unblock their forces, let's not unblock, but to connect the eastern Volchansk with the village by the name of Tikha. The Russians start bombing and attacking Tikha itself with significant number of FABs that we discussed in the previous videos. Later we got reports about significant concentration of the Ukrainians and that they're doing a lot of attempts to send forces from the south to the north, but the Russians were controlling everything and destroying Ukrainians during every single attempt. Later we started receiving updates about some special, some fantastic or phantom foothold that the Russians created on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk River to the east of Borgovatka. And we got a lot of reports about the Ukrainian counterattacks with the purpose to destroy this foothold and to force the Russians to fall back or to create a cauldron. The Russians managed to repel those attacks according to the Russians. So as you can see, the battle is very difficult. We got first FAB 3000 in this area. We got significant number of Ukrainian brigades and battalions that were already lost its combat capabilities. We got report from the Ukrainian side about few Russian battalions that lost combat capabilities. Very, very, summarizing everything, very, very difficult battle. But today on the 10th of July of 2024, probably the situation was completely broken by the Russians, of course, in Russian favor. And the thing is that, if you remember yesterday, we were talking a lot about something weird that was happening in the southern part, more precisely in the northern part of the southern Vovchansk. And according to information we have, the first Russian groups, squads, managed to cross Vovcha River and to establish some foothold in this part of Vovchansk. And we got some video of Ukraine attack, but those reports were, we couldn't trust those reports for 100%, of course, right? But today, today, let's say after night, after we published the video, after we discussed everything together, with this morning, already on the 10th of July, we discussed the situation in the evening of the 9th of July of the local time, and starting of the 10th of July, more and more reliable sources confirmed our projections, confirmed our reports that probably the Russians did manage to cross Vovcha River and to establish more or less reliable stronghold and positions in the southern part of Vovchansk. For example, in this video we can see the arrival of FABs on Ukrainian college, and after that probably the Russians began offensive, and later we got the first changes on map according to pro-Russian sources. The Russians captured exactly this part as we discussed yesterday, and also the Russians captured these high-rise building areas. And this is very important because you know that buildings is always the best thing for the Russians, and they know how to dig in deeper in such a buildings. If Ukrainians, of course, they know this for sure as well, but the thing is that now during this special military operation, we found out that it's not a problem to be encircled for a very long time if the distance between your positions and, let's say, the mainland less than 1 kilometer. Because if the distance is less than 1 kilometer, then the Russians from the mainland can use significant number of drones, and they can bring you cigarettes, water, food, munition, grenades. They can do whatever you like. The only thing they can't do is to bring soldiers or to evacuate wounded, but they can do everything else. Just you can ask if you have connection, if you have communication, radio, you can ask and they will bring everything you want. And currently this is the situation. Probably the Russians captured the college building, and they're trying to repel Ukrainian attacks. The Ukrainians, of course, try to counterattack because they understand that the situation is critical, because the Russians every single day they're bringing more and more forces, they're bringing more and more reinforcements, more munition, and if the Ukrainians are not able to force the Russians to fall back, this is going to be the beginning of the end for the battle for Vovchansk, because the Russians will improve their positions, they will expand their foothold, and they will split Vovchansk at least in two parts, the southern western part and the southern eastern part, and then Ukrainian logistics will be ruined completely, and this can lead to very bad consequences for the Ukrainians. So this is the situation in this area. We'll follow the developments, but something tells me that we are on the final page of the battle, and something tells me that situation will be finished very soon, and most likely in Russian favor. Now let's move to the northern Kupiansk direction. The Russians began a full-scale offensive operation in this area as well. The thing is that this is the first hub, this is the first, how to say, donor or first area that Ukrainians are using for reinforcements if something goes wrong in Volchansk. So that's why to pin down the Ukrainian reinforcements and reserves, the Russians began full-scale offensive, and we got additional updates on the map. According to Deep State, the Russians during the previous weeks and during the previous day captured this territory. Before that, the Russians captured these positions, and then the Russians had control in the forest between Liman Pervy. So very long front line. We see that Sinkovka and the village of Petropavlovka are under very heavy fire. The Russians are bombing these territories with FABs, with self-flamethrower systems. So no chances for the Ukrainians to be active, to be flexible, mobile. They were pinned down by the Russians, and now the Ukrainians need to think where they can get additional reinforcement that they could be sent to Volchansk, while the Russians are attacking in Sinkovka and Petropavlovka. Furthermore, this attack towards Sinkovka-Petropavlovka allows the Russians to increase their pressure along Krakhmalne Pishana. Furthermore, we got updates that the Russians control around 80% of the village, and that the Ukrainians decided to abandon their positions, and they started organized evacuation from Pishana towards Kalinovka. So the Ukrainians can't abandon their positions at once, because there are the distance between, let's say, the village of Pishana and the first strongholds and first reliable positions positions along Oskol River is more than 6 kilometers. So it's a very big distance on the open space on the sky, that where we also can find significant number of Russian drones that are waiting for another Ukrainian that can be attacked and destroyed as a result of FPV drone strike. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Chasov Yar. Let's talk about Toretsk, New York. As for Chasov Yar, we haven't received anything special, just regular activity from the Russian side. It's very difficult to understand whether these episodes are old, there may be new one. The problem is that the Russians were focused mainly on the eastern Chasov Yar, and they managed to capture these territories. Now they need to be focused on the central Chasov Yar. As you can see, most of the buildings were damaged, so there are lots of job to do. There are lots of temporary positions, trenches, fortifications. So probably the next months, maybe last, the Russians will be focused just on this, the reconnaissance operation and attacks with FPV artillery on Ukrainian discovered positions. That's it. Now let's move to Toretsk. We have some changes and adjustments on the map. We got the video that confirms the Russians managed to capture the fields and this rich network of the fortifications. The Ukrainian sources, more precisely the forces of 95th Air Mobile Brigade, published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russians in different places of Toretsk, New York, and Pivnishny, and these towns. And one of the episodes was discovered here, which confirms Russian control over this territory. There was an armored vehicle that was abandoned by the Russians. Infantry most likely entered the forest, and Ukrainians basically destroyed that vehicle as a result of FPV drone strikes. We don't have anything from this part of Toretsk agglomeration, and we have additional update from New York. According to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, Deep State, the Russians captured and entered Petrovska Gora, and the most important, that the Russians captured the citadel inside of this territory, so the high-rise building area. And as you can see, according to geolocations and according to that report, most likely the Russians captured this territory without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. At least we haven't received any updates about some clashes. So and this is very important because this is high-rise building area, and obviously the Ukrainians are no longer able to force the Russians to fall back. So that's it. The battle for Petrovska Gora has ended. It's just a matter of time when the Ukrainians will abandon their positions and when the Ukrainians will move towards the New York citadel and this industrial zone. And from the southwestern citadel, the Russians will think how to move further and how to encircle or how to capture the rest of the New York during the next few weeks or days or something like this. As for the western Avdiivka, the situation is the same as yesterday. The Russians continue moving in the western direction. We have lots of geolocations, lots of map updates confirming additional Russian progress. The Ukrainians abandoned positions in Novosilivka Persha completely. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians using the armored vehicles Bradley were trying to evacuate forces who stuck in Yevgeniivka, but the Russians, as a result of FPV drone strike, first damaged Ukrainian Bradley and then destroyed. So lots of soldiers, lots of Ukrainian forces due to significant and very fast Russian progress, because I'll remind you, at every single day we received additional update about additional Russian progress. When the forces are moving very fast, there are very high risks that some forces, some rearguard forces, armored forces of Ukraine might be encircled. And as I understand, lots of forces were encircled. And currently we have a real cauldron in Novosilivka Persha. If you remember, the Russians blocked the main supply road from Zhelana to Novosilivka Persha. The Russians blocked the Ukrainians between this stronghold and the farms in the northeastern part of Novosilivka Persha. And today we got just a regular and simple video from the southern part of Novosilivka Persha. But this is very important video telling the truth. In this video we can see the concentration of Ukrainian forces who were probably packing their stuff with the purpose to evacuate as fast as possible from the territory of Novosilivka Persha, but the Russians discovered the presence of Ukrainian forces and attacked them. So, and this is the most important from this video, is the place where this happened, and that episode happened in between these tree lines, among the interceptions of these tree lines in the roads, and this is like one of the supply roads, support roads in the southern part. So, telling the truth, summarizing everything, Novosilivka Persha is in operational encirclement. Not even maybe in operational, it's not a cauldron already, but it's more than operational encirclement, it's maybe a tactical encirclement. The Ukrainians lost possibilities to evacuate from this area even using just regular soldiers. They don't have possibilities to supply and support their forces from this area, in this area, and they lost possibilities for evacuation. So this is the first cauldron for a very long period of time. Probably the last cauldron we got a long time ago, maybe even in battle for Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, or maybe even earlier. It's not, of course, big one, but it's the first classic colder, as I understand is going to be. For now, it's also not 100%. Now let's move further. We have additional updates from the south Donetsk direction. There were very heavy clashes between Konstantinovka and Novomikhailivka. The Russians conducted another wave attack trying to enter the eastern part of the Konstantinovka, but that attack was repelled. The Russians suffered significant losses and they were forced to fall back. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, while the Russians are pushing from Novomikhailivka to Konstantinovka, the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack the Russians on the line Konstantinovka-Paraskovyevka, where there are also very heavy clashes. So as you can see, very interesting. While the Russians are moving in one direction, the Ukrainians are trying to attack them from another direction. We'll see what is going to be next. As for Ugledar, the main supply roads, we haven't received anything. And as for Vremivka tactical bridge at Zaporozhye, nothing special, just regular activity from both sides. Kherson direction, the same story. The Russians are bombing and attacking and hunting the Ukrainian positions on the Ukrainian bank of Dnipro River. The Ukrainians are doing the same, but with probably with less activity, with less intensification. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.